Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What's your ghost creepy paranormal story? Story 1. Shadow in the Cave.
During the secret war in Laos, my grandmother's aunt lived in constant fear and uncertainty. One day, she befriended an American soldier who was stationed nearby. As time passed, he began learning basic Hmong to communicate better. The two became close, but after some months, the soldier suddenly stopped showing up. No one knew why, but the general belief was that he had died. Yet, she continued waiting for him, holding on to hope. As the war grew fiercer and the sound of bombs filled the air, they fled to a cave for shelter. It was there, in the dead of night, that the terrifying events began. Everyone was asleep when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was a soldier, but his words were mumbled and broken. "I'm back for you," he repeated over and over again. Her eyes remained shut as she tried to ignore the voice, but the fear grew. Suddenly she felt something cold and heavy reach out and grab her shoulder. The grip slowly moved down her arm to her hand. When it reached her hand, she realized with growing dread that the touch was not human. It felt like a large animal paw, rough and unfamiliar. Terrified, she opened her eyes just a crack, and what she saw froze her blood. Standing over her was a dark figure. It was not human. Its form was distorted, unnatural. The shadow seemed to loom over her, heavy and ominous. Her heart raced as the air felt suffocating, thick with an unknown presence. Then she heard a noise. Her aunt stirred and got up. Something was said, but the words were unclear. The dark figure began to move, and with it, her aunt followed, disappearing into the night, leaving behind nothing but the heavy silence. The rest of the family remained unaware of what had happened until the morning light. The aunt was never seen again. The story that had been passed down was that the dead soldier had come back to take her, but others whispered that it wasn't him at all. Something had imitated his voice to lure her away. Whatever it was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. To clarify, the paw touched my grandmother first. She has never been able to explain why it happened to her, but she knows it did because they were all hiding and sleeping in the cave together that night. Her aunt's disappearance remains a chilling mystery to this day.
Story 2. Who is humming?
When I was 10 years old, I went on a field trip to the Belle Grove plantation in Northern Virginia, located at Cedar Creek Battlefield. The plantation house was steeped in history, with columns still showing damage from the gunfire of the Civil War. It was a beautiful but eerie location, and I had no idea how real the history there would be. One day, while my class was in the plantation's kitchen, listening to the tour guide talk about life on the plantation, something strange happened. There were large double doors on either side of the room, and both were open. Suddenly, we all heard humming coming from outside. It wasn't any of us, and we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. The teacher's aide, who I'll call Bulldog because of her tough appearance, told us that whoever was humming needed to stop. She stepped outside through one of the doors and came back in before walking out the side that led to the garden. She returned shortly, looking puzzled, and told the tour guide that no one was out there, but she could still hear the humming coming from the garden. It didn't seem like much at first, but a few years later, I was reading a Ghosts of Virginia book when I came across a story about Belle Grove. According to the account, the lady of the house had been found in the smokehouse one day, badly beaten, half lying in the embers, with clear fist imprints on her face. She passed away a few days later. A slave girl was accused of the murder and hanged for it. The story also mentioned that the lady of the house loved to walk in the garden, and she would often hum as she did so. Over the years, numerous people reported hearing an ethereal humming in the garden, even though no one was there. When I read that, it hit me all at once. I had witnessed that humming, the very same humming that had haunted the garden for years, long after the lady of the house was gone. That realization sent a chill down my spine.
Story 3. Dead keep playing tricks.
When I was 14, my dad passed away. It's not something to feel sad about, as he wasn't the best person. He had a way of sneaking up on people to scare them, especially by just silently appearing in the corner of their vision until they realized someone was staring at them. After he passed, I began seeing him in the same way, but this time it was from the front entryway, standing and staring at me. I would look over, and he'd be gone. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that wasn't all. My dad was an insomniac who loved watching history and nature documentaries late at night. We had thin walls, so as a kid, I would have to beg him to turn down the volume so I could sleep. After he passed, for months, at least once a week, I would hear the TV on in the living room at night. It would be one of the same documentaries, like a biography of Winston Churchill or a show about ants. It always spooked me. My brother wasn't watching TV because he was deaf, and even if he did, he would mute it. My mum worked nights, and this would happen when she wasn't home. My sister had been living on her own for a while, so it wasn't her either. I would get up to check, maybe thinking the cat had turned the TV on. But Max, the tuxedo cat, was usually with me in bed or outside. I'd walk down the hallway, through the kitchen and dining room, and by the time I reached the living room, all the noise would stop. It would be completely silent, so quiet it was almost unnatural. But it didn't stop there. After my dad passed, the front door, which was locked, chained, and deadbolted, would open by itself to let the cat in. This happened several times in front of other people during the winter after my dad's death. The creepiest incident, though, happened one night when I was in the basement watching TV. My mum was upstairs in the living room. Whenever she needed me, she would stomp on the floor to get my attention. So when I heard a furious stomp, I rushed upstairs. She was sitting in a chair, and in front of her was a wooden TV tray table with a styrofoam cup on it. The cup was shaking violently. There were no open windows, no fans, and nothing attached to the cup to make it move. I checked it thoroughly. But when I put the cup back on the table, it started shaking again. My mom insisted it had to be my dad, as he used to be a trickster. But everything that had been happening, the creepy visions, the TV turning on by itself, the cat coming in through the locked door, freaked me out. After double-checking everything, I just shouted out, "If that's you, Dad, knock it off." And just like that, the cup stopped shaking. After that, the cat stopped opening the door by itself. The TV stayed off at night, and I never saw my dad's figure in the corner of my vision again.
Story 4. Dead Visit the Living.
I am the youngest of 2 older brothers. My middle brother passed away in 2005, and a few years later, one of my cousins gave birth to a boy who had never heard of or seen my brother. Fast forward to when the boy was around 5 years old, and my aunt casually mentioned to my mum that her son had an imaginary friend named Michael. At first, they brushed it off as just a child's fantasy, but things started to take a strange turn. This imaginary friend, Michael, would wake the boy up in the middle of the night, asking him to play basketball. The boy, who also loved basketball, didn't mind, but it seemed odd, especially considering the hour. Then, Michael would tell the boy he had an owie and point to his throat. It seemed like an innocent enough detail, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling it gave me. I'll come back to that part later. The real chilling moment came when my mum went to visit my aunt. She was sitting on the couch when my cousin and her son entered. The boy hesitated, walked past my mum, and went straight to his room. My cousin then told my mum something that sent a chill down her spine. He was being shy because he told me that's Michael's mum. That's when it hit me. Later, my aunt showed the boy a photo of my brother, and he pointed at it, saying, "That's Michael." When I went to their house, I witnessed it for myself. The boy, whispering to my cousin, said, "That's Michael's brother." Here's the kicker. My brother's name was Travis Michael. He loved playing basketball in high school. He died in a freak accident at the San Luis Obispo sand dunes while riding an all-terrain vehicle. The ATV crash shattered Adam's apple, suffocating him. How could this little boy, who had never met him, know so much about my brother? The connections were undeniable and too eerie to be a coincidence. The boy didn't just know my brother's name, but the specific details of his life and death. It felt like something beyond the ordinary, a connection from the afterlife itself.
Story 5. Laughter turns to screams.
This happened about 8 years ago, around Thanksgiving, at my grandmother's house. Everyone was asleep except for me. The only people in the house were my grandparents, my mom, brother, and I. No one else. This is key. I was on the computer because I couldn't sleep. I turned on a small television to watch Adult Swim while I browsed the internet. At around 4:30 a.m., I started feeling a chill up my spine and I heard some children laughing. It was distinctly the voices of a little girl and boy. I knew I was all by myself as far as being awake, so I turned to look at the television, and it was in the middle of an Inuyasha fight sequence, so there was no way the laughter was coming from that. I checked the computer's sound settings and I had every possible output muted, so it wasn't that either. I sat there confused for a few moments while the giggles of the 2 children continued to play in the background. I figured maybe the radio in the kitchen was on. It was digital, so maybe it just came on for some reason, or it had a timer. I got up, and I kid you not, as I was walking to the door, with each step, the laughter grew louder. From giggling to guffaws to hard laughter. Once the guffaws started, I began to hear a baby crying as well. What's going through my mind now is, what kind of radio show is this? And I had just taken 3 steps, nowhere near the door. I took a few more steps and the laughter turned hysterical, if not maniacal. The baby's cries turned to screams and wails, as if it were in pain. I was trembling and terrified with each step I took toward the doorway. but my mind was on autopilot. I needed to get out of there and across the hall to my mom, who surely would help me and notice the weird sounds too. The last couple of steps increased the laughter and crying to an almost deafening decibel. It was like I was at a concert and the speakers were directly in my ears, blasting noise. It was painful and frightened me deeply. I gathered all the courage I had, and as soon as I reached the doorway, I was going to sprint. I started to run, but then something shoved me. I felt these hands at my chest push me back into the room with enough force to throw me off balance. The crying and laughter stopped as soon as I was back in the room. This all happened within 20 to 30 seconds, but it felt like 10 minutes. I was so scared that I cried and slept in the tiny armchair before my grandmother came in the room and made me sleep in her bed downstairs.
Story 6. Forgotten Graveyard.
As a child, I grew up in a wildlife refuge on Long Island, Wetham. Around the time of the American Revolution, the Hawkins family established the area, town of Brookhaven, and owned a vast amount of property. The Bartow family, also spelled Bartow or Bartow, was the other major landowner at that time. Together, they owned most of the county. There's a Bartow family graveyard across the street to the north of the preserve, and a Hawkins family graveyard a few miles further north. While exploring the preserve, we discovered an additional Bartow family graveyard. The most recent grave marker was from the mid-1800s, and it looked as though no one had visited in decades. The fence was knocked down. Trees were scattered all over. There were no paths, no signs, and no markings, nothing. While reading the headstones, we noticed something strange. It was completely silent. This is a wildlife refuge, so there should have been animals everywhere. Birds chirping, deer running, squirrels scurrying. But here, absolute silence. No wind, no traffic, no birds, no animals, not even a mosquito. It was so quiet that I could hear the blood pumping through my head. It was also strange that there were no trees inside the fence. No plants grew there. The ground was covered in leaves and looked untouched, yet nothing seemed to be growing. Everything around it appeared to be dying as well. Suddenly there was a loud crack, followed by an earth-shaking thump as a tree on the outskirts fell, landing just a few feet from us. That pushed the creepy factor to the next level, and we immediately ran out of there. Afterward, we searched the library, town records, refuge records, word of mouth, and the internet, but we couldn't find any mention of this graveyard. The other graveyards were all documented and photographed, but this one didn't even get a footnote.
Story 7. Following Shadows.
When I was a senior in high school, my mom and I went to the Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri. I didn't know much about it, except that my aunt had written a paper on it for her psychology class, and she said it was really interesting. The museum is located in a newer building, with the actual old hospital next door. The exhibits feature a bunch of equipment and belongings left behind by patients when the psychiatric hospital was running in the early 1900s. There were a lot of creepy relics from what I can only describe as the golden days of questionable therapy methods and procedures, but honestly, none of this bothered me at first. Side note, The museum also has exhibits on the local Native American tribes and the Pony Express. We entered the main floor, which had nothing too interesting, just a gift shop and a few small displays. I was fine until we reached the second floor, where the psychiatric exhibit began. As soon as the doors opened, I felt something. Not physically, but in my mind there was a figure. It looked kind of like a Death Eater from Harry Potter, only it wasn't as big and didn't have a head. It seemed to follow us around the floor, through the psychiatric exhibit, and eventually stop. I told my mum not to mention anything so I wouldn't be influenced by her feelings. I looked at the items left behind by former patients, and I felt a presence telling me not to touch any of them, as if something bad would happen. Finally, we made it to the Native American exhibit, and the figure was there again. It followed us but stayed about 20 feet behind, stopping whenever we stopped. We took the elevator to the morgue area in the basement. You'd think I'd feel something there, but no, nothing. Finally, we went to the main floor and left. When we got home, I mentioned to my mum that it felt like something was following us. She agreed and said she saw it too. I decided to do a test. I had us face away from each other and draw what we thought it looked like. Turns out we drew the exact same thing. Afterward, I emailed the museum to tell them what I experienced. I didn't expect a response, but they did write back. They told me what I experienced was actually a very common occurrence among their guests and staff, and that they have allowed investigations from time to time. So yeah, that's my story about the Glore Psychiatric Museum.
Story 8. Haunted Bridge of Rural Tennessee.
There's a bridge near where I grew up in rural Tennessee that is notorious for strange and terrifying screams at night. The screams aren't audible to the houses nearby, and supposedly you have to sit on the actual bridge to hear them at all, though I personally haven't tested it myself. The common explanation is that a bobcat lives under the bridge, but people have checked with dogs and have never found any signs of one. Well, some friends and I had heard this story for years while growing up but never decided to test it. One night, after a few beers, we got the idea to go and test the legend. So 5 friends pile into a beat-up car and we drive down to the bridge. It was about 1:30 a.m. and it was dead silent outside. We sat there for a good 45 minutes and nothing happened. We had the windows down and had started debating whether or not the story was just a myth when the scream happened. We had the lights off and there was a moon so you could see fairly well, but for sure there was nothing outside the car. But then the scream was incredibly loud. It sounded just like a woman with incredibly powerful lungs having her skin ripped off right outside the window on the rear passenger side that faced off the edge of the bridge. Now, I've heard bobcats in heat while hunting, and they do make a scream, scream, scream kind of noise. It's hard to describe, but they do it in little repeating bursts. This scream, however, was a long 3 to 4 second, extended scream at an incredible volume. We quickly drove away from there like something was chasing us. A couple of miles down the road, we finally stopped to process what had happened. My adrenaline was racing so much that I was shaking uncontrollably. One of my friends had actually soiled himself, which I had never seen anyone do. One friend immediately left the car and vomited. To give you a good frame of reference on how terrifying this was, my friend, whose car we were in, wasn't even mad at the friend who had an accident on his seat. It was insane. To this day, I have no explanation for it.
Story 9. Blood Trail.
During a summer semester at university, I woke up early one morning to get ready to help with an orientation visit. I had fetched my hygiene bag and was walking down to the dorm's bathroom showers when I noticed that the bathroom door was left wide open. I peeked in to find all 4 showers running at once, emitting a thick, humid cloud that made it hard to see through. That there were only 12 of us left in the dorm made it easy to get used to one another's routines. So I knew that I was the only one who should be in here showering at 6:10 a.m., much less with all the showers on full blast. I called inside to see who was there. Only the sound of spraying water answered back. I mumbled to myself that I didn't have time for this as I sleepily shuffled 1, 2, 3 steps into the sweltering fog when I saw something that got me fully awake. There on the floor was a red footprint. 2 bloody red footprints. 4 freshly wet, bloody red footprints. Peering through the tropical mist, I could make out a trail of crimson footprints leading from a shower to where I was standing, staining the tile floor past the sinks, and towards the wall with the window, which had been forced open. I didn't stick around for a second look. I quickly dropped my bag and hightailed it back to my room, slammed and bolted the door, and called the front desk. A resident assistant was down there in minutes, followed shortly by a police officer. Yes, the footprints were from blood, but they couldn't find a blood trail leading to the shower, only leaving or anything sharp in the bathroom that would have caused such bleeding. The likelihood was that the person had cut themselves with something they brought into the shower stall, and all other residents on the floor were accounted for, with the soles of their feet in good condition. And since we all had electronic access to the dorm, none of us needed to go through the window. The only thing they could reason was that whoever had sneaked in must have heard me coming down the hallway, missing their crazy escape by mere seconds. I decided not to go back to the showers that morning and just threw on my university shirt to get to the student orientation, which was uneventful that day, minus parents and students' questions about dorm life. That was just one of several strange things that happened that summer.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.